To this day, much of what you see in a farmer's market in Israel still comes from Samaria. For a good portion of the Old Testament, the abundance grown on this land was a visual reminder of God's promise of salvation, executed through Abraham and his children in the core of the promised land. They understood that without God, their land and its bounty would not connect to his atonement and the plan of ultimate forgiveness. But was this all there was to God's promise? Was it just about good food, descendants, and land? Was God doing something even more unique and spectacular in Samaria for his chosen people? This episode will discover how Samaria's good land became even better while God's physical presence was in it, and how this part of Samaria's spiritual history plays into Jesus' time with the woman at the well. The land of Israel is an incredibly diverse landscape. Here you can find everything from fertile farm fields to snow-capped mountains to barren wilderness, all within just a few driving miles of one another. My name is Jack Beck. I'm a Bible geographer, and for the better part of 3 decades, I've been studying the unique ecosystems of this land and how they impact the stories in our Bible. This is the 4th and final season of the Holy Land. It's been an amazing journey, and in season 4, we're going to be visiting 4 different regions: Samaria, the Negev, the Southern Wilderness, and New Testament Jerusalem. We're going to see how the Lord used this land to anchor his message and then explode the gospel outward to the rest of the world. Join us, and I'm convinced that your Bible reading will never be the same again. Welcome to Shiloh, about 15 miles away from Shechem and from Jacob's well, where John 4 takes place. This is the spot where the spiritual realm and the physical realm touched in a profound way, making it the center of faith during a major part of the Old Testament. This was the first city the Israelites built after coming into the Promised Land. I'm talking hundreds of years before places like Bethlehem, Capernaum, and Jerusalem were even a thought in the collective minds of God's chosen people. This is Abigail Levitt. She's worked as an archaeologist here at Shiloh while living in Israel. She too has a deep passion for this place, a location that has grown her understanding of Jesus and built her faith in him. So Abigail, we're here at Shiloh, and I would love, first of all, for you to give us a sense of why here, why establish a city here rather than somewhere else in this area of Samaria. What is there about the site of Shiloh that lends itself to living?
Well, when we're looking at the land, we're very near the patriarchal highway that runs up the central ridge of Israel. Israel kind of has this mountainous ridge up the center of it, north to south, and so it's an ancient highway. The modern road is down in the valley. The ancient road maybe was along the ridge up there. So Shiloh is just really ideally situated. Trade, water, agriculture, doesn't get much better than this.
Abigail, everything we've said about Shiloh so far sounds like a lot of other cities and towns of Samaria. But there's something special here, something that makes this good land even better. Could you share that with us?
Over the past 100 years, archaeologists have been coming to Shiloh and looking for the Tabernacle. They've proposed several sites where it may have sat. Some people say it should be up on the top because that's where you put a holy site. Some people have proposed locations to the north and the south.
I wish you guys would stop doing that because it makes the site harder to teach. Every time we come here, there's a new idea.
A new idea, yeah. So when we were excavating here, though, and we're on the northern slopes of the Tell, we started uncovering a massive building. We're calling it the Monumental Building because we're not quite sure what it is. But as we've uncovered it, we've discovered some really interesting things. So the way the space is divided, this is a long, narrow building, runs east-west, and it's divided 1/3 to 2/3. And if you read in the Bible the instructions for the tabernacle and later the temple, we see that this is the way the space is divided, where you have the holy place and then the smaller Holy of Holies.
So when we read about the Lord telling Moses, you need to build this tabernacle, it's made out of animal skins.
It is.
How do you reconcile an animal skin tabernacle with a fieldstone tabernacle?
So we're assuming that when the Israelites first arrived here with Joshua, they would have pitched the cloth or skin tabernacle, the one that had come with them through the wilderness. That's probably what they started with. But later on, we start seeing a few clues that maybe they eventually built a permanent structure here.
So where are we?
If this is indeed the tabernacle, this would have been the Holy of Holies, where we're standing right here.
That's amazing. Well, we know for sure the tabernacle was here.
Oh, yeah.
Joshua 18:1 says it was put in place here. How does that make the good land of Samaria even better?
Well, the Israelites have come into this land, and basically what they do is they make a covenant with God. And in a way, they make God the king of their new country. And then they come here to Shiloh, and they pitch the tabernacle, and that tabernacle is where they can come and meet with God. And that's what makes this so special, is that God put his presence with them, and he's dwelling among them, and they can come here and meet with him.
Yeah, so just like the visible presence of the Lord moved with them through the wilderness, that presence moves here to Shiloh.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can't think of anything that would make this place more significant in the larger Samaria space than that.
No, we always think of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because that's where the temple was. But before that, and for several hundred years, this was the place.
Yeah, and for 300 plus years, it continued to be the place,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So we're not talking about a short blip in history. We're talking about centuries before there was a temple in Jerusalem. This was the Jerusalem. So in Joshua 18, we see the establishment of the tabernacle and of God's presence amongst his people. But something else occurs in this passage that pushes forward God's plan of forgiveness and salvation as well. The tribes of Israel receive their land inheritance from God. I'm wondering, from an archaeologist's perspective, what value is there in receiving my own land?
These are people who have been slaves in Egypt. They've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they're finally coming into this land where God had promised them houses they didn't build, vineyards they didn't plant. So I think this is very important to them, because this is where they're going to settle down, they're going to raise their families, they're going to plant their crops. This land is going to make a living for them.
It's striking to me that there's another very important spiritual significance to this. Land and the gospel of forgiveness were intimately bound from the time of Abraham, right? And so when people of the Old Testament era thought about the forgiveness of sins symbolically, there was no cross for empty tomb.
No.
So what are they left with? The land. And so as I till my soil and kick my rocks around, I'm thinking not just there's my food, but there's my forgiveness too.
Yeah, it's all bound in the promise.
Everything we've seen and learned about this place leads to one conclusion. God's presence here is what made the promised land worth living in. Samaria is where his chosen people could worship and interact with him, almost like Adam and Eve in Eden. What an incredible gift. I wish I could tell you that the Israelites became more prosperous and more enriched by falling more in love with the Lord and his law. But that's not what happened in Samaria. It took only a few generations for the Israelites to forget God, even while he was still among them here in Shiloh. All manner of evil began to pour out of people's hearts, from the priests at the tabernacle on down. To be sure, they loved the land and the wealth it could offer, but they came to value that more than they valued God himself. And as we'll see, this reversal to selfishness and pride would cause Israel to split into two kingdoms. It all started when they tried to manipulate the Lord and his power for themselves.
The Israelites are going to go to battle with the Philistines, and I think they make a really poor choice. They decide to take the Ark of the Covenant with them into battle. They think that the box that represents the presence of God is a good substitute for God himself, I think. They don't consult God. They just take the Ark of the Covenant out to battle, and they lose it. The Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, so that's pretty bad news.
It strikes me that the Israelites here were treating the Ark of the Covenant in a very pedestrian way. You were treating the Ark of the Covenant like a talisman, like a good luck charm that's somehow going to bring you victory on its own, apart from the presence of the divine.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that they're really copying the traditions of the locals, the Canaanites, who probably took their gods, their wooden or metal gods, into battle with them. And I think that this is something that the Israelites are probably copying pagan worship practices and trying to maybe fit in a little bit.
So we have the loss of the priests, we have the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, and we're still not at the worst of it.
Oh no, it gets worse, because the next thing that happens is that the Philistines come to Shiloh and they attack and destroy Shiloh. We see in the archaeological evidence, there's a destruction layer where we see a lot of charcoal. We were able to get it carbon dated, and it dates to that period when the Philistines and the Israelites are battling. So even though this is something that's not directly mentioned in the biblical narrative, archaeologically that's something that we see. And later on in Jeremiah, it's alluded to where God through Jeremiah says, "Go now to Shiloh and see what I did there." And he's talking about the destruction that's going to happen to Jerusalem and comparing it to the destruction that already happened at Shiloh.
I feel that one in the bottom of my stomach because for the next 125 years, what becomes of Tabernacle and Great Altar and Ark of the Covenant, these worship items are no longer in the same space and aren't going to be until Solomon brings them back together at the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's a long time to go without your united center of worship.
On television, I've observed Christians who have watched their church burn. And the grief and the sadness that they're pouring out at the loss of their worship home. And I can't imagine how they would feel as they watched their sacred city burn.
You know, they had something really special. Like, for us, a church building, that's sad, but we still have Jesus with us, right? For them, the tabernacle here at Shiloh, that was their connection with God, and now that's gone. I
think Psalm 78 captures that. It says that the Lord, Natasha, abandoned Shiloh. He left it behind, which is just the polar opposite of what people expected when they came to this space.
That is really a sad thing, that here they had an opportunity to connect with God, and he abandons that because they abandoned him.
Yeah.
And they've lost this connection.
Samaria stories. They're good stories, but they go bad. And you know, they just go bad when the wealth of the land, the abundance, the gifts of the giver obscure the giver himself.
Right.
And I wish that was a problem of the past, but it continues to be a problem in the present.
I think we can still lose sight of what's important. We can lose sight of, the atonement that Christ made for us. We can take things for granted. I think that this is a problem through the ages.
Good land still goes bad. As we end our time in Shiloh, I can't help but be reflective. A good land, made even better by God's presence, had a sudden and dramatic reversal that didn't stop in Samaria. This corruption grew and grew until Israel separated into two nations after the death of Solomon. And do you know where this occurs? In Shechem/Sychar, at the core of the promised land where all of God's promises were given to Abraham. When one kingdom became two, Judea preserved Jerusalem as its center of worship, but the northern kingdom developed multiple worship centers, all of them mixed with pagan practices and gods. Both kingdoms would suffer unimaginable losses and be crushed under the oppression of foreign powers. It's in this dark part of the story that we finally understand who the Samaritan woman was, where she came from, and what Jesus is actually accomplishing in John 4.